A spark of kindness. In the heart of Chicago, amidst the bustling streets, towering skyscrapers, and the constant hum of the city, lived a woman named Amelia. The city, known for its steel heart and fast pace, rarely slowed to notice the lost, the weary, or the forgotten. Yet there was one person who chose to notice them, every single day. Amelia worked as a social worker, pouring her heart into the lives of those society often overlooked, the homeless, the addicted, the forgotten souls who roamed the streets unnoticed. Her days were spent at soup kitchens, shelters, and local outreach programs, tirelessly helping anyone who needed it, without hesitation or second thoughts. Amelia's empathy had been a part of her since childhood. Raised in a family that had everything, her life was marked by a deep sense of privilege. Her parents, though loving and well-meaning, had always emphasized the divide between their world and the world of those less fortunate. They taught her to be cautious, to keep her distance from the unknown, and to protect herself from what they called the dangers of the streets. But Amelia was different. She refused to be defined by the walls that her parents had built around her. There was an innate understanding within her that people, regardless of their status or circumstances, deserved compassion, dignity, and care. She began to volunteer, first at local shelters, then at soup kitchens, and eventually became involved in outreach programs that sought to bring lasting change to people's lives. Every moment she spent helping others shaped her deeply, not just as a professional but as a person. Amelia grew more determined, more dedicated, and more passionate about her mission to give back to those who had been forgotten. One evening, as the winter chill began to creep into the city streets, Amelia was walking home from a particularly challenging day at work. She had just finished a meeting with a local community center, trying to organize an outreach program for homeless youth, and the exhaustion weighed heavily on her. She passed through the back streets of the city, avoiding the busy sidewalks, when something caught her attention: a small figure huddled in the corner of a doorway. The boy looked barely older than 10, his clothes ragged and his face gaunt with hunger. His eyes, wide and filled with a mixture of fear and desperation, locked with hers. Amelia stopped in her tracks, her heart aching. She had seen many faces like this before: children, teens, adults, all trying to survive in a city that had no mercy for the vulnerable. But this boy, this young soul, seemed to hold something more. His stare wasn't just one of fear, it was a silent plea for help. Without thinking, Amelia reached into her bag and pulled out the sandwich she had packed for herself that afternoon. It wasn't much, just a simple turkey and cheese sandwich. But in her eyes, it was an offering of hope. She crouched down in front of the boy, her gentle smile extending to him like an open invitation. "Hey," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you hungry?" The boy looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. He was hesitant, his fingers twitching as if unsure whether he should trust her or not. Amelia didn't push. She simply held out the sandwich and waited. It was a long moment before the boy took a tentative step forward, then another, until finally he accepted the food from her. "Thank you," he muttered quietly, his voice hoarse and filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Amelia smiled, the warmth in her heart swelling. "What's your name?" "Thomas," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Thomas," she repeated, trying to commit the name to memory. "Where's your family? Are you alone out here?" Thomas hesitated. His eyes flickered to the ground, avoiding her gaze. "I don't have a family anymore," he mumbled. They don't care about me." Amelia's heart ached. She could see the pain in his eyes, the raw vulnerability in the way he held himself. The world had let him down, but she wasn't going to be one of those people who walked past and pretended not to see him. "You're not alone," she said firmly, looking directly into his eyes. "I'm here. I won't leave you out here." And from that moment on, Amelia began visiting Thomas every day. It started with small acts of kindness, bringing him food, clothes, a blanket, sometimes just sitting with him as he shared his thoughts. She learned that Thomas had been living on the streets for months, his family torn apart by addiction and poverty. He had tried to find work, but at his age, no one would give him a chance. He was just another nameless, faceless kid in a city that had no time for him. As the days passed, their bond grew stronger. Thomas began to trust Amelia, and he opened up to her in ways he hadn't with anyone else. He told her about his dreams. He wanted to be an artist, to paint and draw, to create things that could make people feel something. But more than anything, he wanted a chance at a better life. A life where he didn't have to be afraid of what the next day would bring. He talked about his fears of the coming winter, of not having enough to eat, and of the darkness that seemed to follow him everywhere. Amelia listened, her heart aching with every word. She could see the light in his eyes, the spark of hope that he still carried with him, even in the face of all the hardship. Every day, Amelia promised herself that she would be there for him, that she would help him however she could. She was determined to make sure Thomas knew that he wasn't forgotten, that there was someone who saw him and cared about him. Her visits to Thomas became a ritual. She would bring him a hot meal, sometimes homemade, sometimes leftovers from her own family dinners. They would sit together, eating and talking, and for a while, the world outside seemed to fade away. For those precious moments, there was no hunger, no cold, no fear, just the warmth of human connection, the shared understanding that they were in this together. But one day, Amelia arrived to find that Thomas wasn't where he usually sat. His usual spot was empty, the doorway abandoned. She looked around, her heart pounding, hoping he was just a little farther down the street, but he wasn't. Panic began to set in as she hurriedly asked the other homeless people nearby if they had seen him. Some shook their heads, others muttered that they hadn't seen him in days. Days turned into weeks, and still there was no sign of Thomas. Amelia's heart grew heavy with worry. She contacted the police, social services, even local hospitals, but no one had any information about him. Thomas had simply vanished without a trace. Amelia's world seemed to dim without him. She tried to keep her focus on her work, on the lives she was trying to help, but every day she felt the absence of the young boy who had captured her heart. She couldn't stop wondering what had happened to him, where he had gone, and whether he was okay. But in the back of her mind, she refused to let go of the hope that one day she would find him again, that she would somehow, someway, be able to give him the future he deserved. Little did she know, Thomas had not forgotten her. And though their paths would be separated for many years, fate had a way of intertwining their lives once again. The passage of time. As the years passed, Chicago remained a city of endless movement, its streets constantly filled with the ebb and flow of life. The seasons came and went, the days blending into one another in a blur. For Amelia, time seemed to stretch, each day becoming a mix of the busy demands of her work, the faces of those she helped, and the persistent ache of not knowing what had become of Thomas. Amelia's work as a social worker had grown more complex over the years. She had become well known in the city, respected for her deep empathy and relentless drive to improve the lives of those who were struggling. She had established several outreach programs for homeless youth, helped countless families escape the grip of addiction, and worked with local shelters to provide food, shelter, and job training to the city's most vulnerable. But no matter how many lives she touched, no matter how many people she helped to change, there was always one face that haunted her, a young boy named Thomas. The memory of him lingered in the back of her mind, always there, a constant reminder of the boy she had met on that cold winter night. She could still see his eyes, the mixture of fear, hope, and sadness, and the way he had looked at her when she handed him the sandwich. It was a look she would never forget, one that had imprinted itself on her heart. But life, as it always does, kept moving forward. Amelia continued her work, pouring herself into each project, each person she met. She became a trusted figure in the community, a pillar of support for those who had nowhere else to turn. But with each success, there was a part of her that felt unfulfilled. It wasn't the success that was missing. It was the sense of closure that she so desperately needed when it came to Thomas. She had never stopped hoping, never stopped wondering where he had gone. Every time she passed the old alleyway where they had first met, she would glance down, half expecting to see him sitting there, waiting for her to bring him food or to talk about his dreams. But he was never there. As the years wore on, Amelia's professional success began to take its toll on her personal life. She had sacrificed much for her work, her time, her relationships, her own needs, and she found herself isolated in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had friends, of course, but the demands of her job meant that they often saw little of her. Her life was defined by a constant push to help others, to make the world a better place, but it left her feeling hollow at times. There were moments when she longed for something more, something personal, something real. But those moments were fleeting, and she pushed them aside, burying herself even deeper in her work. Meanwhile, life had not been kind to Thomas. After their last meeting, after the day she had disappeared from his life, Thomas had wandered the streets aimlessly. He had continued to scrape by, surviving on the streets, using his creativity to earn small amounts of money. He would draw portraits for passers-by or make small sculptures out of trash, trying to survive in any way he could. But the streets were unforgiving, and he learned quickly that hope could be as fragile as the paper he used for his drawings. Thomas's family had long since disappeared from his life, consumed by their own addictions and struggles. The one stable relationship he had, the one thing that had kept him going through the darkest times, was Amelia. He never forgot her kindness, her belief in him, and the way she had looked at him, not with pity, but with understanding, as though she saw the person he could become, not just the homeless boy he was. She had given him a gift, a sense of worth, and he carried that with him every day, even as he struggled to survive. But even with her memory guiding him, life on the streets was hard. As time passed, Thomas fell further into the harsh realities of his existence. His dreams of becoming an artist seemed impossible as he battled the elements, hunger, and exhaustion. Yet, despite the crushing weight of his circumstances, he never fully gave up. He kept drawing, kept painting, kept believing that someday someone would see his talent and give him a chance. One day, when he was in his early 20s, something inside him clicked. He was tired of barely scraping by, tired of fighting for survival each day, tired of living in constant fear of the next cold night. But he knew that if he wanted to change his life, he had to do something different. It was then that he made a decision that would alter the course of his life forever. He enrolled in a local community college, using every penny he had saved up from his artwork. It wasn't much, but it was enough to pay for one semester's tuition. Thomas's decision to pursue education was a turning point in his life. It was hard, so much harder than he had imagined. He felt out of place, surrounded by students who had come from stable homes and who didn't have to worry about their next meal. But Thomas had always been resilient, and his determination began to shine through. He worked odd jobs during the day and studied at night, pouring everything he had into his studies. His passion for art grew stronger with each passing day, and for the first time in years, he felt like he had a future. As the months went by, Thomas found his life slowly shifting. He met professors who encouraged him, classmates who became his friends, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. He even managed to get a small studio space to paint in, using the little money he had to buy supplies. His art flourished, his techniques improving, his confidence growing. Yet, despite all the changes, Thomas never forgot Amelia. She remained a constant in his heart, the memory of her kindness and support a guiding light through the dark times. He often wondered if she was still out there, still helping people. He hoped with all his heart that she was, but he never knew how to find her. His time on the streets had left him with no connections, no way to trace the path that led to her. But fate has a way of intertwining lives in ways no one can predict. One cold winter's day, Years after Thomas had first disappeared from Amelia's life, their paths crossed again in a way neither of them could have ever imagined. Amelia, now a seasoned social worker, was driving home from a late meeting, her mind occupied with the details of her next project. She had just left a community outreach event, feeling a sense of fulfillment as she thought about the lives she was helping. The winter roads were slick with ice, and despite her usual caution, the car suddenly skidded on a patch of black ice. Amelia's body tensed as the car spun out of control, the world around her seeming to move in slow motion. She gripped the steering wheel, trying to regain control, but it was too late. The car crashed into a guardrail with a violent jolt. The world went dark. As the car came to a stop, everything went quiet. The pain hit her all at once, and her body screamed in protest. Amelia's head throbbed, and she could feel the warmth of blood trickling down her forehead. Her breathing was shallow, the world around her spinning. Panic surged through her chest, and she tried to move, to call for help, but her limbs felt heavy and unresponsive. Her vision blurred as she lost consciousness. She was rushed to the nearest hospital, her body battered and broken, her life hanging in the balance. Doctors worked frantically to stabilize her, trying to assess the extent of the damage. But Amelia's fate was uncertain. Her injuries were severe, her internal bleeding critical. It seemed like a miracle she was still alive. And yet, it was in this very moment of uncertainty, of desperation, that their paths were destined to cross once more. Dr. Thomas Evans, a young doctor who had just finished his residency, was called to the emergency room to assist with Amelia's case. He had no idea that the woman he was about to encounter would change his life in ways he could never have imagined. The doctor's revelation. The emergency room was a whirlwind of activity. As the paramedics wheeled Amelia into the trauma bay, the staff moved with precise urgency, securing her to the table, running tests, and quickly assessing the severity of her injuries. The room was filled with the sound of beeping machines and the rapid-fire exchange of medical jargon. But beneath it all, a young doctor named Thomas Evans stood still, his eyes fixed on the patient before him. Thomas had been working long hours at the hospital, moving quickly from one case to the next, barely able to keep up with the constant demands of his residency. But when he looked at Amelia, something shifted inside him. He had seen countless patients in his time, many of them with injuries much worse than hers, but Amelia's presence seemed to resonate deeply within him. There was something familiar about her, something that tugged at the edges of his memory, though he couldn't quite place it. As the team worked to stabilize Amelia, Thomas moved closer to her bedside. He wasn't sure what it was that kept drawing him to her, but there was a sense of urgency that went beyond the normal duties of a doctor. He needed to understand more. He needed to know her story. When the nurse removed the sleeve of Amelia's jacket to examine her injuries, Thomas saw it, the small, faded tattoo on her wrist. It was a simple image of a bird with outstretched wings, soaring into the sky. His heart skipped a beat, and he felt an immediate jolt of recognition. That tattoo. He hadn't seen it in years, but he knew it instantly. It was a symbol that had been etched into his memory, tied to a moment of kindness and hope he would never forget. Years ago, when he was living on the streets of Chicago, a woman had given him a similar drawing, a bird in flight, a symbol of freedom, of hope, of the possibility of a better life. She had been the only person to show him kindness when the world seemed to have abandoned him. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. Amelia, the woman he had once known, the woman who had cared for him when he was just a lost boy on the streets, was lying in front of him. She was the one he had never been able to forget, the one who had given him food, clothes, and, more importantly, a sense of worth when he had felt invisible. She had never left his mind, even after all these years. Thomas stepped back, his mind racing. Could it really be her? Could this woman, the one who had fed him, encouraged him to chase his dreams, and had helped him through some of the darkest times in his life, be the same person lying in front of him, fighting for her life. He couldn't believe it. The years that had passed since their last encounter felt like an eternity. He had spent so much time trying to make a life for himself, to rise above the circumstances he had been born into, but he had always carried Amelia's kindness with him. It had been the one thing that had kept him going through medical school, through his residency, through the sleepless nights when he thought about giving up. And now fate had brought her back into his life, but under the most tragic of circumstances. Thomas felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Shock, disbelief, and a deep sense of gratitude all collided inside him. He had always wondered what had become of her, whether she was still helping others, whether she had found peace and happiness. And now, here she was, lying in front of him, her life hanging by a thread. He took a deep breath, pushing aside the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He had to focus. Amelia was in critical condition, and she needed him to be a doctor, not someone lost in the past. He could not let her down. She had been there for him when he had nothing. Now it was his turn to help her. He snapped back into his role, giving orders to the team, directing them to prepare for emergency surgery. He knew the risks. Amelia's injuries were severe. Internal bleeding, multiple fractures, possible spinal damage. Her chances of surviving this were slim. But Thomas refused to give up on her. He couldn't, not when he owed her everything. Hours passed in a blur as the surgical team worked tirelessly to save her life. Thomas's hands moved with practiced precision, each incision, each stitch, a desperate attempt to put her back together. His mind was focused, but a part of him couldn't help but wonder how this would all end. Would she make it through? Would he be able to repay her for all the kindness she had shown him? Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the surgery was complete. Amelia was stable, though still unconscious, and the team moved her to the intensive care unit for further observation. Thomas stood at the foot of the bed, staring at her with a mix of exhaustion and hope. The battle wasn't over yet, but they had bought her time. He had saved her life, but now it was up to her to fight for her own survival. As he left the ICU, Thomas felt a deep sense of relief mixed with an overwhelming urge to connect with her, to talk to her, to tell her everything he had never been able to say all those years ago. But he knew it wasn't the right time. Amelia was still in critical condition, and he couldn't risk overwhelming her with emotions when she needed rest and recovery. The next few days passed slowly. Thomas continued to visit Amelia, checking on her progress, watching as she slowly began to regain consciousness. Each time he entered her room, his heart swelled with a mixture of pride and anxiety. He had saved her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more he needed to do. And then, one morning, it happened. Amelia's eyes fluttered open, and she took in her surroundings. The bright lights of the ICU, the beep of the machines, the sterile scent of the room. All of it was disorienting, but there was something else in her eyes. Recognition. Amelia. Thomas's voice was barely a whisper, but she turned her head, her eyes locking onto his. She blinked in confusion, as though trying to place him. Her expression shifted, from one of foggy uncertainty to a flicker of recognition, and then, slowly, her lips parted. "Thomas," she croaked, her voice hoarse from the anesthesia. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. "Yes, it's me," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "It's Thomas." The silence between them stretched, filled with the weight of unspoken memories. Amelia's eyes widened as the realization hit her. Her mouth opened in disbelief. You're the boy. The one I helped." Thomas nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Yes, it's me. I've never forgotten you, Amelia. I never could." Tears welled up in her eyes as the floodgates opened, and she whispered, "I've always wondered what happened to you. I never thought I would see you again." They shared a long, quiet moment, the bond between them rekindled in an instant. The boy she had helped all those years ago was now the doctor who had saved her life. In that moment, neither of them needed to say anything more. The circle had come full circle. Amelia's kindness had planted a seed in Thomas that had helped him grow into the man he was today. And now, in a twist of fate, it was his turn to give back. As he looked down at her, lying there, fragile but alive, he promised himself one thing: he would not let her fall. He would be there for her, just as she had been there for him. Their paths had crossed once more, and this time, they would walk together through whatever came next. The strength within. Days turned into weeks, and Amelia's recovery from the accident became a long, arduous journey. The initial rush of relief that had come with surviving the surgery had quickly given way to the stark reality of her situation. While the doctors had managed to stabilize her and save her life, the road ahead was uncertain. Amelia's body had been badly battered, and the injuries to her spine were severe. She could no longer feel her legs, and the doctors had been clear that there was no guarantee she would ever walk again. In the quiet moments between therapy sessions, as Amelia lay in her hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't help but think about how much had been taken from her. Her independence, her mobility, the very things that had defined her life and her work, gone in an instant. The accident had shattered not only her body, but the future she had worked so hard to build. She had dedicated her life to helping others, to making the difference in the world. And now she found herself dependent on others just to get through the day. At first, the darkness threatened to consume her, the overwhelming sense of helplessness, of being trapped in a body that no longer obeyed her commands, weighed heavily on her spirit. There were days when the hopelessness seemed too much to bear, when the pain from her injuries and the frustration of her new reality felt suffocating. Her life had been a whirlwind of activity, always on the move, always helping others, and now she was confined to a hospital bed, unable to do the things she once took for granted. But even in those moments of despair, there was something inside her that refused to give up. It was the same fire, the same determination that had driven her to become a social worker, to make a difference in the world. It was the same spark that had made her reach out to Thomas all those years ago when he had been lost and hungry on the streets. She couldn't let this setback define her. She couldn't let her disability steal the essence of who she was. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but Amelia made the decision to fight. She couldn't control everything. She couldn't change the past or undo the damage to her spine. But she could control how she responded to the present. She would find a way to live her life, to adapt to her new circumstances, and to continue her work, even if it meant doing so in a completely different way. Her first step was to embrace physical therapy. When the doctors explained the extent of her injuries, she listened carefully, taking in every word. Her body had been through a lot, and rehabilitation was going to be a long and painful process. But Amelia wasn't one to shy away from a challenge. The doctors and nurses who attended to her were amazed at her resolve. While many patients in her condition fell into despair or denied the severity of their injuries, Amelia faced each session with a quiet determination. At first, her movements were slow and stiff. She couldn't feel her legs, and the simplest tasks, like sitting up or shifting her weight, were difficult and exhausting. But every day, she pushed herself to do a little more. She had never been the type to take things for granted. And now, more than ever, she understood the value of every small victory. Whether it was lifting a finger, turning her head a little further, or simply sitting in a wheelchair for a few minutes longer than the day before, she celebrated each accomplishment, no matter how minor it seemed. The physical therapist, a woman named Rachel, was initially unsure of how to approach Amelia's case. Amelia was determined, yes, but she was also clearly struggling. The injury to her spinal cord had left her in a place where progress seemed impossible. Still, Rachel was impressed by Amelia's tenacity. Amelia refused to accept the limitations imposed on her. Every morning, she greeted Rachel with a smile and a renewed commitment to her therapy. One of the hardest aspects of rehabilitation was not the physical work. It was the emotional toll. There were moments, especially in the early days, when Amelia felt a crushing sense of isolation. She had always been so independent, so active, and now she had to rely on others for even the most basic tasks. Her hand shook when she tried to brush her hair, and her frustration boiled over when she couldn't get her legs to move. But every time that frustration crept in, she reminded herself of why she was doing this. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for all the people she had worked with, for all the lives she had touched, and for the belief that one person's determination could still make a difference. One morning, as Amelia was finishing a particularly grueling therapy session, she found herself alone in her hospital room, staring out the window at the gray skies. It had been a tough few weeks, and the thought of spending the rest of her life in a wheelchair was overwhelming. As the weight of her situation pressed in on her, she was surprised to hear a knock on the door. It was Thomas. She had seen him a few times during her stay. He had been in and out of her room, checking on her progress, offering words of encouragement, and providing medical updates. He had always been professional, but there was something more in his eyes now. There was a bond between them that couldn't be ignored. "Amelia?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. He stepped inside, holding a small bouquet of flowers in his hands. "I hope you don't mind," he said with a sheepish smile. "I thought these might brighten up the room a little." Amelia's heart lifted at the sight of him. It had been so long since she had seen a friendly face, and Thomas's presence always seemed to give her a sense of calm. He wasn't just her doctor. He was a reminder of everything she had worked for, everything she had overcome. "Thank you," she said, her voice cracking slightly as she reached out for the flowers. "They're beautiful." Thomas placed the bouquet on the side table and pulled up a chair beside her bed. They sat in silence for a moment, both lost in their thoughts. Amelia could feel the weight of the conversation hanging between them, but for once she wasn't sure how to begin. Finally, Thomas spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about what you've been going through," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "And I've seen you fight, every day. I just want you to know that you're not alone in this. I'm here for you." Amelia looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sadness. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to live like this." Thomas reached out, placing a hand gently on hers. "You don't have to do it alone. We'll figure it out together." The sincerity in his words struck a chord deep within her. For the first time in a long while, Amelia felt a flicker of hope. She had been carrying the weight of her new reality on her own, believing that she had to face it alone. But now, here was Thomas, offering his support without hesitation. "I'm scared," Amelia confessed, her voice trembling. "I'm scared that I won't be able to help others anymore. That I won't be able to do the work I love. I don't know if I can keep going." Thomas squeezed her hand. "I know it's terrifying, but you've already shown everyone, including me, what it means to never give up. You're not defined by what happened to you. You're defined by who you are. And I know that the person you are will find a way to keep going." Amelia took a deep breath, her chest tight with emotion. She had always believed in the power of human connection, in the strength that came from helping others. And now she had to believe that she could continue to help, perhaps not in the way she had before, but in a new way. She looked at Thomas, a sense of resolve beginning to form within her. "You're right," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in days. "I can't give up. I won't give up. There's still so much I want to do." Thomas smiled, his eyes filled with pride. "That's the spirit. And I'll be here to help you every step of the way." From that moment on, Amelia made the decision to embrace her new reality, not as a limitation, but as an opportunity for growth. She would find a new way to serve others, to make a difference, and to live a life filled with purpose. And with Thomas by her side, she knew that she didn't have to face this battle alone. As the days passed, Amelia's physical therapy continued, and slowly she began to regain strength in ways she hadn't thought possible. She was learning to navigate her new world, to adjust to the challenges that came with her disability. But more importantly, she was rediscovering the strength within herself, the same strength that had carried her through so many difficult moments in the past. And with each passing day, she became more determined to face the future with courage, to keep moving forward, and to live her life with purpose. The bridge between past and future. Amelia's days in the hospital began to blur together. The world outside her room felt distant, as though she were in a different universe entirely. The physical therapists had developed a rigorous routine for her, each session slowly inching her closer to the independence she had lost. But the emotional toll of her injury remained heavy on her heart. Each morning, as she struggled through the exercises, a quiet battle raged within her. Between the relentless desire to regain her old life and the growing acceptance that her world had irrevocably changed. Yet, amid the chaos of adjusting to her new reality, Amelia found that there was a shift occurring within her, subtle but undeniable. She had always been someone who believed in the power of service to others, in the strength that came from giving. It was part of her DNA. But now, as she sat in a hospital room, facing a future she hadn't expected, she began to understand that she could still serve others, that she could still make a difference in ways she hadn't yet imagined. She wasn't bound by the idea of helping only through physical action. She could still help through her voice, her empathy, and her understanding. But just as she was beginning to accept this, the weight of her past began to come into sharper focus. It wasn't just her physical limitations that weighed on her. It was the deep sense of loss, the feeling that in some ways she had lost herself. She had always been the woman who helped the broken, who offered solace to the weary. She had never imagined she would be the one needing help. Thomas's presence during her recovery had been a constant. At first, he had appeared as a doctor, tasked with overseeing her rehabilitation. But his visits soon became something more. He was a friend, a lifeline, someone who understood the journey she was on in ways that no one else could. It was impossible to ignore the bond that had formed between them. Their conversations went beyond the sterile updates on her physical progress. They delved into the heart of their shared experience. They spoke about their hopes, their fears, and the impact that one simple act of kindness could have on a person's life. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow across her hospital room, Thomas pulled a chair up beside her bed. It had become a ritual for him to visit her after his long shifts at the hospital. She had come to look forward to these quiet moments where they would talk about the world outside, their shared memories, and the future they were both striving toward. "How's the physical therapy going today?" Thomas asked, his voice calm, but filled with genuine concern. Amelia exhaled slowly, her hands resting on her lap. "It's going. I'm making progress. Slowly, but I'm making progress." Thomas nodded, offering a reassuring smile. "That's good. It's going to take time, but you're strong. I can see how hard you're working." Amelia looked out the window, her eyes distant. "Sometimes, I don't feel strong. Some days, I just feel lost. I'm not who I used to be. I don't know if I'll ever be the person I was." Thomas's expression softened, and he leaned forward slightly, his eyes searching hers. "You're still the same person, Amelia. You've always had this light about you, this ability to make others feel seen, to give them hope. That hasn't changed. Your body might be different, but your heart, the essence of who you are, that's still there. I've seen it every day." Amelia blinked back tears, surprised by how much comfort his words gave her. "I don't know if I can continue my work. I've always been out there, on the ground, helping people in need. But now, I feel so confined to this room, to this wheelchair. How can I keep doing what I love when I can't even walk anymore?" Thomas gently placed his hand on hers. "You may not be able to do things the way you did before, but that doesn't mean you can't make an impact. You have a voice, and you have your heart. You can still reach people, just in a different way. You've done it before, Amelia, and I know you can do it again." The quiet sincerity in Thomas's voice reached deep inside her, a part of her she had kept locked away since the accident. The woman who had once believed in the power of kindness and service was still there, even if she hadn't known how to find her. It wasn't about physicality anymore. It was about her ability to connect, to show up, and to continue being the beacon of hope she had always been. The days that followed were filled with new challenges and breakthroughs. As Amelia's therapy continued, she gained more strength, and slowly, she learned to navigate her new world with the help of a wheelchair. Her therapists showed her how to adapt her environment at home, teaching her how to make her living space more accessible and how to perform tasks that once seemed impossible. She was beginning to rebuild her independence, one step at a time. But what surprised her most was the new sense of purpose that began to blossom within her. Amelia had always been driven by the desire to make a difference in the world. But in the aftermath of the accident, she started to see her work from a new perspective. She realized that her mission hadn't ended, it had only taken a new form. She began making phone calls to her colleagues, reaching out to the shelters and community centers she had worked with before. Even though she was no longer physically able to show up in person the way she once had, she still had connections, influence, and wisdom to offer. She began organizing virtual meetings with other social workers, discussing ways to provide support for the homeless and marginalized communities in Chicago. She used her voice to advocate for those who were still struggling, sharing stories and insights from her years of work in the field. It was a different kind of work, but it was still work that mattered. And in those moments, when she was helping others, she realized that she was healing too. Her newfound sense of purpose brought a sense of peace she hadn't expected. As she worked alongside her team, brainstorming new outreach strategies and ways to make sure the city's homeless population received the care they needed, Amelia began to feel a spark of hope again. She wasn't just sitting in a hospital room anymore. She was still making a difference. And that, more than anything, gave her the strength to continue pushing forward. One morning, as she was reviewing some documents, her phone buzzed. It was a message from one of her old colleagues. The message was simple, but the words struck her deeply. "Amelia, we're starting a new initiative in the community. We want you to be a part of it. Your wisdom and experience are exactly what we need." Tears welled up in Amelia's eyes as she read the message. It was the moment she had been waiting for. The world hadn't forgotten her, and she wasn't done yet. She was going to be part of something bigger, something that would make a lasting impact on the community she had always fought for. But what Amelia didn't know was that her journey was about to take an unexpected turn. As she leaned into her newfound purpose, she began to realize that her past, her history with Thomas, was also a part of this larger story. Their paths had crossed once more for a reason, and that reason was about to reveal itself in ways they could never have imagined. It was time for them both to understand that the bond between them was not just the result of kindness, but of fate itself. The story of how one woman's compassion had saved a boy, and how that same boy had returned to save her, would evolve into something far more profound than either could have anticipated. They were about to learn just how interconnected their lives truly were, and how their shared experiences could help them move forward together. The path forward. Amelia's life had shifted in ways she hadn't expected, and it was difficult to ignore the lessons that came with it. As the days rolled into weeks, her focus began to change. The frustration she had initially felt about the limitations imposed by her wheelchair began to fade into something softer. It wasn't about fighting against her body anymore. It was about learning how to live within it. She had already accepted that the life she had imagined before the accident, where she was always on her feet, always moving, always helping in the most tangible ways, was no longer a reality. But that didn't mean she couldn't contribute in other ways. She was starting to see the possibility of a new version of herself, one that could still inspire, still help, still serve, but from a different vantage point. Thomas had been a constant in her recovery, offering not just medical care but emotional support that no one else could provide. In the beginning, he had been there to save her life, to get her through the darkest part of the physical healing process. But now, as Amelia began to rebuild her life, their conversations began to evolve. No longer was he just a doctor who checked on her progress. He had become a friend, a confidant, and a fellow soul who understood what it meant to rise from the depths of hardship. Their bond deepened with every visit. They would sit together, often for hours, discussing everything from the mundane aspects of life to their deepest fears. Thomas shared his own struggles, how the weight of his past as a homeless boy had never fully left him, and how his journey to become a doctor had been riddled with self-doubt and imposter syndrome. Amelia, in turn, opened up about the anger she had felt toward her situation, the isolation of her newfound disability, and her initial difficulty in accepting the slow pace of her recovery. One afternoon, after yet another grueling physical therapy session, Thomas returned to her room as usual. Amelia had been working particularly hard on regaining movement in her arms and learning how to use a modified wheelchair with greater ease, but her body had been resisting. The pain was constant, though lessening with each passing week. She was exhausted, and the weight of it all was starting to wear on her. "Another rough session?" Thomas asked, his expression full of empathy. "Rough doesn't quite cover it," Amelia replied, her voice dry. She glanced out the window, watching the clouds float across the sky. "I feel like I'm moving forward, but it's always at a crawl. There are days when I feel like I'm stuck, like the same issues keep cropping up, no matter how hard I try." Thomas sat down beside her, his eyes gentle but filled with understanding. "I know the feeling. When I was in medical school, I spent nights wondering if I was ever going to get past the trauma of my childhood. It felt like an endless loop, one step forward, two steps back. But it was those small victories, the tiny bits of progress, that kept me going." Amelia turned her head toward him. "And you didn't give up?" "No," Thomas said firmly. "I had moments where I wanted to. I had doubts, fears, and a constant internal battle telling me that I wasn't good enough. But in those moments, I reminded myself of the person I wanted to be, and I thought of all the others who were counting on me to make it. It was never about how quickly I got there. It was about showing up every day, even when it felt impossible." Amelia nodded, absorbing his words. "I don't know if I have that kind of strength. Some days, I just feel like I'm not enough. That maybe I can't make the difference I want to make anymore." "Amelia," Thomas said softly, leaning in so she could see the sincerity in his eyes, "you've already made a difference. You've helped so many people, and that hasn't changed. You may not be out there on the front lines the way you used to be, but your work, your heart, your vision, they're still there. You're still changing lives, even if it's in a different way. People will still look up to you because of the strength you've shown, and you'll continue to inspire them." There was a long pause as Amelia processed his words. The doubt inside her began to recede just a little, like a shadow retreating with the dawn. She had always prided herself on being the one who gave, the one who made things happen. But now she was learning that it wasn't about doing everything herself. It was about creating a ripple effect, one small action that could grow and multiply, even if she couldn't see the full picture. In the days that followed, Amelia began to find new ways to contribute. She took on more advocacy work, using her voice in ways that felt empowering. She connected with various organizations she had worked with before, offering insight, advice, and direction from her new perspective. She used her position to raise awareness about issues that she had always fought for: homelessness, addiction, mental health. But now, she was more intentional about the method. She spoke at local community forums via video calls, sharing her personal journey and the lessons she had learned through her rehabilitation. She wanted others to understand that their circumstances didn't define them, and that even in the face of the most devastating challenges, they still had the power to create change. But there was more. Amelia's work extended beyond advocacy. With Thomas's support and encouragement, she began to reimagine the way she could provide hands-on assistance. Her old programs for homeless youth and families were still running, but now she worked remotely to ensure that they continued. She partnered with local food banks, shelters, and health organizations to help distribute resources more effectively. Her influence had expanded beyond the walls of any single organization. She was connecting people who needed help with the people who could give it. And that, she realized, was its own form of service. As weeks passed and Amelia's physical recovery progressed, she found herself becoming more involved with the community she had once served. She attended meetings, not just as an advocate, but as someone who had lived through hardship and emerged stronger. Her presence, even from her wheelchair, became a symbol of resilience, reminding others that there was always hope, no matter how difficult the road ahead seemed. But it wasn't just her physical strength that was growing. Her relationship with Thomas was evolving too. The connection they shared had begun as a professional one, a doctor-patient relationship, but it had deepened into something more profound. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a quiet bond forged in the crucible of shared experience. They had both struggled in different ways, but they had found each other in the midst of those struggles. One evening, as they sat together, reflecting on the progress they had made, Amelia looked at Thomas with new clarity. "You've been a big part of this for me," she said softly. "You've helped me see that there's more than one way to make a difference. I can't thank you enough for everything you've done." Thomas smiled, his expression warm. "You don't have to thank me, Amelia. It's your strength that's gotten you this far. I'm just here to walk beside you." The truth of his words resonated deeply with her. They had been walking together, side by side, both of them learning to navigate the world in ways they hadn't expected. And it wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving in the face of adversity. They were creating new paths, not just for themselves, but for others. Amelia's journey had come full circle. The young woman who had once given everything to help the most vulnerable had now become a beacon of hope herself. She had discovered the depth of her own strength, not in what she could do physically, but in her ability to adapt, to reinvent herself, and to keep fighting for others, even from a place she hadn't imagined. And though the future was still uncertain, Amelia knew one thing for sure: she wasn't done yet. There was still so much to be done, and with Thomas by her side, she felt ready to face whatever came next. Together, they would continue to make a difference, each in their own way, knowing that the power of kindness, resilience, and hope could change the world, one small step at a time.